So in today's video, I'm going to show you a simple technique for painting dogs. I use a straightforward 7-step method, and by the end of this video, you'll be able to turn any photo of a dog into a cute illustration like this. You can follow this process with any brushes you want, but I'll list the exact ones I used in the description below. So as I mentioned, I'm using a 7-step process for this, and I want to start the video by showing you a kind of fast-forwarded overview. Step 1. Create a very rough sketch based on the reference photo. Usually this ends up being too scratchy to use as a painting guide, so I usually go over it again and make a super smooth outline version of it. Step 2. Roughly paint on the main colors. I'm just focusing on the flat colors of the fur and ignoring all the shading and small details. Step 3. Create the fur texture by blending. In some areas where the color is very consistent, I'll manually paint on the texture. Step 4. Refine the shape of the dog by using the eraser to cut back everything that went beyond the sketch. Step 5. Use shadows to bring out the depth and shape of the dog. If it's not enough, you can also add some outlines. Step 6. Create all the main surface details like the eyes, the nose, the collar, anything like that. I recommend making all of these on a bunch of different layers, separate from the dog. Step 7. Use the warp and liquefy tool in Procreate to kind of adjust the overall posture and vibe of the dog. Usually I keep the eyes on a separate layer during this process, so when it's finished, I'll move the eyes back into position and then this illustration is all done. Personally, I found this method to be very reliable, and it's pretty much the same process I covered in the cat painting tutorial. Now let's move on and go through the process again, but this time I'll slow down and explain everything. So I've got my reference photo already placed in here. I've just placed it above everything, like even above the paper texture, and then I'm going to make a rough sketch of it on a separate layer. I always try to do my sketches very simply, just using simple shapes and trying to catch the vibe of it. But the sketch doesn't have to be close to perfect or anything. I'm really happy if I feel like it's 70 or 80% right. As we go through this process, we're going to improve on it and add more character, so it's okay if the sketch starts out a little bit imperfect and maybe boring. Now, everybody has their own style of sketching, but there's 2 tricks I want to mention real quick that I use quite often. The first one is, with the face, I always make it as simple as possible, so I'll often do the eye closed. And then when I paint it, I'll actually do the eye how it's supposed to be in the end. And then another thing I do a lot is using the selection tool set to freehand, and I can move things around and change their position. So for example, if this leg doesn't feel right, I might just kind of isolate it and then move it around and kind of play with it with the arrow tool and see if it fits better a different way. And occasionally I'll even use the warp tool to do the same thing, but this time focusing more on adjusting the posture. And there we go, this kind of initial rough sketch is finished. The next thing I need to do is kind of create a perfect outline, because this is way too rough to use as a painting guide. So to do that, I'm going to lower the transparency of my dog sketch so I can barely see it. I'll make a blank layer above it, and I'm going to continue using the same sketching brush. I'm just going to crank up the stabilization in Procreate just so I have super clean and smooth lines. And once the smooth outline is finished, I'm going to get rid of my initial sketch and just work with the outline. I recommend setting the transparency mode of it to multiply. You can lower it a little bit just so it's more subtle, but make sure you start painting on a blank layer down here, below the sketch, below everything, even below the paper texture. For the brush, I'm going to use the wet and abstract brush, and I'm just going to very roughly kind of blot down all the different colors of the fur and roughly where they are. And finally, with all the main colors roughed out like this, we can move on to my favorite step, which is adding all the texture. And for that, I recommend using this Barb Plumage blender brush, the one at the bottom here. And what it does is it just blends things together, but in this kind of stringy way. So I'm just going to go over the whole dog, just blending the fur like that. And I'm trying to do this, not too chaotically, not too perfectly, somewhere in the middle, and just kind of in the direction where I imagine the fur would be going. And there we go, this blending looks really good. Now this gives the edges of the colors a lot of texture, But on a dog like this, where there's lots of these kind of blank areas of a solid color, they don't end up with much texture at all. So in that case, I recommend just manually painting on the hair texture. So for that, I'm going to change my brush to the streaky barb liner. I'll make a blank layer above my dog. And for example, I'm going to choose a slightly off-white color. And this brush looks similar to the blender brush, it just creates these kind of parallel lines. And I'm just going to go over some of these areas and paint on the texture like this. And usually this turns out way too dark, and that's why I did it on its own separate layer. So I'm going to set this layer transparency mode to multiply. I'll lower it, set it to a point where it's just barely visible. Then I'll make another layer, and I'm going to do it again, but this time on the black areas. And just like before, these ended up being way too light in this case. So I'm going to adjust the transparency as well. I'm not going to change the transparency mode, I'm going to leave it set to normal. I'm just going to mess with the opacity and adjust it like this. Now the last texture that this dog in particular has are these kind of spots. Not a lot of dogs have those, but if I imagine this dog as a caricature, I think these are pretty important to add into the illustration. So to do those, I'll make another blank layer, choose a darker color, and because this is just kind of like speckles, I'm just going to grab the speckles brush and use that. And I'll just dab it around like this. It also turned out a little bit too dark, so I'm going to reduce the opacity. And I think that pretty much covers all the textures on this dog, so I'm going to merge everything together onto one layer so I can move on to the next step. And in the next step, we're going to focus on kind of the overall shape of the dog. And we're going to start by cutting everything back so it matches the sketch. So I'm going to make sure my dog layer is selected. I'm going to grab the eraser brush, which is set to the feather vein daughter, just because it's opaque, but it has a very rough edge. And I'm going to go all along my illustration so far and just erase it back until it matches the sketch and I'm left with a silhouette. And once everything is cut back like this, we can move on to the next step, which is focusing on kind of the shape and the depth. And we're going to do that by adding shadows and a couple of outlines. And I'll start with the shadows first. So for that, I'll make a blank layer above my dog. I'm going to choose a pretty saturated dark color, kind of a version of whatever color the dog is. So in this case, something like that. Any brush will work. I think I'm going to use the wet and abstract again. And I'm just going to draw on the shadows where I want them to be. Now, some shadows are going to have a hard edge and some have a soft edge. And I think this makes a good example. So this shadow, the purpose of it is to bring out kind of some depth here. So it makes sense that this side of it is quite sharp, but I want to soften that side. So to do that, I'm going to change to the water blender and just kind of fade it a little bit. And I'm going to do the same trick to the other shadows wherever they need to be softer. And in some areas, my shadows went kind of outside of where I want them to go. So I'm just going to use the eraser brush to kind of shave them back. And I think this is pretty good. I'm happy with the position of those shadows. So what I'm going to do next is change the transparency mode of the shadow layer to multiply. Then I'll lower it to 0. And I'm going to very carefully and slowly raise it up just until they're there. I don't want to overdo the shading, so I like to keep this at a minimum. Now, if I turn off the sketch, just temporarily, you can see the shadows brought out a lot of good depth, but I think it's not quite enough, and that's why I like to resort to outlines. So for that, I'm going to make another blank layer. I want to use a very rough, kind of scratchy brush. There's nothing in this kit that's suitable for that, so I recommend going to the drawing tab here in Procreate and using the little pine brush for this. And I'm just going to draw on a couple different shades of this beige tone, just basically choosing whatever color will stand off around the other colors. And I'll use that to define some of these edges that the shadows just don't quite get. And once the shadows and outlines are finished, I recommend merging kind of everything once again onto one layer, and we can move on and start finishing this up by adding all the little details. And those are going to be on their own layer. I'm actually going to use several different layers, kind of as many as I need to add all the details. For the brush, I'm going to do it all with the feather vein daughter brush, and I think it's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to turn my outline back on and just start painting on these details. I guess the only critical thing is, with the eye, always make sure it's on its own separate layer because we might want to position it later on. Everything else can be on combinations of different layers, just whatever you're comfortable with. And there we go, that pretty much finishes up all the details and stuff. Now, it's optional, but what I usually do at this point is merge everything together onto one layer except the eyes, and then I'll use the warp tool and the liquify tool, kind of a little bit sparingly, to adjust the posture and some of the small details. The reason I keep the eye on a separate layer, of course, is I don't want that to get warped. And once I'm happy with how the posture looks and everything, I'll kind of reposition the eye and finalize the illustration. And just like that, this illustration is finished. I think the challenge with painting dogs is really the huge variety of body shapes. It's like for me, I just can't picture a dog in my head clear enough to paint from that, so I always have to use reference photos. Feel free to check out one of these videos next if you want to learn how to paint other types of animals and characters.